So we're going to start off our discussion talking about three betting by going over several three betting fundamental concepts. So before we get into talking about the details of three betting for value versus three betting as a bluff and defending against three bets, we need to cover our fundamental concepts of three betting before we do all that. So that's what we're going to cover in this video. So let's start off by defining what a three bet is. And it's very simple. A three bet is when another player re-raises the pre-flop raise. So the pre-flop raise is going to be the first person to open raise. And when you open raise as a pre-flop raiser and somebody re-raises you, that's a three bet. And a lot of people get confused as to why this is called a three bet. Well, I want to make sure that I define that. So the first bet in no limit hold'em or just limit hold'em is going to be the blinds. So the forced blinds that are posted by the small blind and big blind before the hand is even dealt, that's considered the first bet. Then when you put in your pre-flop raise as the open raiser, that's considered the second bet. Now in your mind, that actually may look like it's the first bet because you're the pre-flop raiser and nobody else has raised yet, but the blinds are always going to be considered the first bet. And so that's why when somebody raises a pre-flop raise, that's why we call it a three bet. Now you may hear people referring to this in both pre-flop and post-flop play. Some people will call, for example, post-flop if somebody decides to put out a continuation bet and then somebody raises and then there's a re-raise, they may call that a three bet. But 99% of the time when we're talking about a three bet, we're talking about it pre-flop. So somebody may refer to this concept post-flop when they're talking about a hand, but a majority of the time when you hear a poker coach talking about this, they're talking about pre-flop play and they're not talking about post-flop. So with that said, let's talk about why we three bet. So there are only two reasons for three betting, and it's either for value or as a bluff. And so let's talk about this a bit more. So for value, well, this is when we have a hand that's too good to call, such as pocket aces or pocket kings, and we expect to get called by worse hands when we three bet. And again, just like we talked about when we talked about the reasons to bet and betting for value, when we are betting for value as a three bet, we want to get called by worse hands. So yes, we are betting what we think is the best hand, but we're also thinking when we three bet, our opponent is going to call us with the worst hands. Then on the flip side, we can bluff. So when we have a hand that's too bad to call, such as a hand like pocket threes or ace deuce suited, and we expect our opponents to fold to our three bet, then we can put in a three bet bluff instead. Now, in regards to the different ranges, and we're actually going to look at them on the next slide. So we don't devise them as purely value three bets and purely bluffs. Either somebody's only going to be betting value bets, and we call that a depolarized range. And we'll look at this on the next slide. And then there's people that will value bet as a three bet, and they'll also put in some bluffs. Well, we call that polarized. So let's take a look at those. Let's visualize what those are. So here's an example of a depolarized range on the left. And here's an example of a polarized range on the right. So you notice pocket jacks, pocket queens, kings and aces, ace king, and ace queen suited. So a depolarized range is a three betting range where your opponent is only three betting for value. And sometimes people will call this a strong linear range. On the flip side, we have opponents, and as you move up in stakes, people are going to start three betting you as a bluff in addition to three betting you for value. So I put some example hands in here, such as ace two suited and ace three suited, pocket twos and pocket threes, and a couple suited connectors. And so when you see a range that's composed of both value bets and bluffs, we call that a polarized three betting range, because when your opponent is three betting you, they're polarizing what they're doing. They're either on one end of the spectrum where they're value betting a strong hand, or they're on the other side of the spectrum where they are putting in a three bet bluff. Now we're going to talk about the different ranges that we would utilize for a polarized or a depolarized, or actually we'll talk about good three bluffing hands and the criteria for that. And we'll talk about things that we need to look for when we look to three bet as a value against our opponents. And we have separate videos on both of these. So the next thing that I want to talk about is three betting at the micro stakes. And specifically talking about 2NL, 4NL, 5NL, and 10NL, the bottom of the barrel, the smallest buy-in games that you can play. So here's the thing, this is what I've noticed, and a lot of poker coaches that I've worked with agree with me, is that you shouldn't be 3-betting as a bluff too often at their micro stakes for one specific reason: our opponent's inability to fold to a 3-bet. So if our opponents have an inability to fold to a 3-bet, then we shouldn't be bluffing them. We should actually be doing the exact opposite. So if we think about it, 3-bluffing too often against opponents of the micro stakes that cannot fold or do not want to fold can become an expensive strategy, because we're going to be bloating the pot against these loose recreational calling stations at the micro stakes that don't want to fold their hand. So you're going to find yourself in a lot of bloated pots with very marginal hands, such as ace-deuce suited, 6-7 suited, pocket fours, all sorts of weak holdings in a bloated 3-bet pot. So my recommendation is do not 3-bet bluff that often at the micro stakes when you're playing against these types of opponents. We want to do the exact opposite. We actually want to bet for value more so than we would against an opponent that is playing a stronger range. And we'll take a look at some of this stuff as we progress in the course. So remember, when you're playing in softer micro stakes games, you'll often see these loose passive opponents, and it's not very rare to see them call 3-bets and 4-bets with a very wide range of mediocre holdings. You may at first be dumbfounded, thinking, why in the world is this opponent calling a 3-bet or a 4-bet when our opponent clearly has a strong hand and they're calling this with a hand like ace-9 suited or 7-5 suited or pocket deuces? It's because I want to play hands. I mean, it's in their nature. That's the type of player that they are. So don't be dumbfounded when you see that. Just be happy when you see that, because that's the type of person you want to attack with a 3-bet value bet. So let's talk about one more thing. So this is going to build on that point in regards to 3-betting at the micro stakes. And we're going to talk about several other things, but I want to talk about this specific point as it relates to 3-betting at the micro stakes. Fold equity and 3-betting go hand in hand. So one vital important consideration when you're looking to 3-bet bluff is you need to look at how often your opponents are likely to fold. And we call that fold equity. So fold equity, I have a definition here. It's the additional equity that you stand to gain based on the probability that your opponent will fold to a bet or a raise. So the more often that we expect them to fold to a bet or a raise, the higher our fold equity. The less often, the lower our fold equity. So if we think about it, the less inclined people are to fold to our 3-bets, then the less we should be 3-betting as a bluff, because we have a small amount of fold equity. So again, this all goes back to our fold equity. If they're not folding that often, then we don't want to be 3-bet bluffing. And instead, we should be looking to widening our 3-bet value range. And we'll be taking a look at this in the next video when we take a look at 3-betting for value. So, and here's the thing. I'm not saying that you shouldn't 3-bet bluff at the micro stakes. What I'm saying is that you should do it sparingly and only in ideal situations, which you'll learn about as we progress in this section. So remember, when we're playing against loose passive types of opponents at the micro stakes, our general strategy altogether revolves around maximizing value. And let me actually talk a bit more about this. So since we're talking about 3-betting, our 3-betting strategy should revolve around maximizing value. Well, what you're going to find out as well as we progress in the course and we start looking at our post-flop play, the same thing goes with that. We're going to be looking to maximize value against weaker opponents. Bluffing, 3-bet bluffing, stealing as a bluff. In general, the weaker our range gets, the more often we're going to be bluffing either pre-flop or post-flop. And that's just not a huge overall portion of our strategy beginning at the micro stakes. As you move up in stakes, yes, it will be, but at the beginning, no, it's not going to be. So I just want you to understand that. So with all that said, Our 3-bet progression at the micro stakes should be something like this. So if you are a beginning or struggling poker player, or if you've had issues with 3-betting and not doing very well in 3-bet pots, well, follow this basic progression. At first, I want you to begin with a strong depolarized 3-betting range. So in other words, don't be bluffing that often, or don't bluff at all to start off. That's perfectly fine. And don't start putting bluffing hands and building a polarized range until you're comfortable playing in 3-bet pots. And when I talk about that, I'm talking about comfortable playing in 3-bet pot when it comes to pre-flop play, and also when it comes to post-flop play, because when it gets to the flop, we're going to be playing in a much bigger pot, and it's not uncommon for 3-bet pots to go to the point where we get all the money in either on the flop, the turn, or the river. And then once you're comfortable playing in 3-bet pots, and you can play post-flop well, and this is a very important part of this, is that in 3-bet pots, you definitely need to be able to play well post-flop, because the margin of error in regards to how big of a mistake you can make is going to be a lot higher in these type of hands than when you're playing in a single raise pot, just because there's just so much more money in the pot, especially in situations at the micro stakes where you may be going 3 ways to the flop in a 3-bet pot. So, but once you're comfortable playing well post flop, you can begin adding in bluffs and start playing a depolarized range with a few of the better bluffing hands. And we'll talk about this. We'll talk about the criteria and the different type of hands I'd recommend. And we'll also be looking for ideal spots to bluff as well. So again, we'll be talking about that in a couple of videos. So again, it's very simple. Start off by not bluffing, and then as you improve both pre-flop and post-flop, then start looking to add in some bluffing hands and build a depolarized range, looking at specific ranges of hands that are good for bluffing and looking at ideal spots. So let's talk about one more thing, and that's going to be our default 3-bet sizing. So when it comes to 3-betting at the micro stakes, I recommend that you follow this sizing. And this is a fairly common and accepted 3-bet sizing that's used by a lot of good poker players, not only at the micro stakes, but also when we move up in stakes. So when we're out of position and we want a 3-bet, we should typically make it around 3.5x our opponent's open raise sizing. So let's say that we are in the small blind, and let's say that cutoff open raises to 3 big blinds. Then we're going to make it 3.5x his sizing. So it's just 3 times 3.5x. Now on the flip side, let's say we're in position. Let's say that cutoff open raises to 3 big blinds, and we're in position on the button. Then we can make it smaller, and I typically recommend that you just do 3x of the open raise sizing. Now here's a caveat to this. If your opponent is only open raising to 2 big blinds, or 1.5 big blinds if a side even allows that, or 2.5x or 2.5 big blinds, I recommend just basing your sizing off 3 big blinds. So while you could base it off a 2 big blind raise or 2.5 big blind raise, just make it off of a 3 big blind raise, especially when you're 3-betting for value, because we want to increase the amount of money that we can win. And just by increasing it slightly, basing it upon a 3 big blind open raise, it's going to bump up the pot just a little bit more. So why do we bet more when we're out of position? Well, it all comes back to positional disadvantage. So we bet larger when we're out of position because we want to encourage our opponents to fold. And even with our value hands, and the reason is because it's harder to realize our equity when we're out of position, so we don't mind if they fold. And you may think, well, why would we want to do that with pocket jacks, pocket queens, pocket kings? Well, if we think about it, let's say that we 3-bet pocket jacks and the flop comes down in ace high or king high or queen high. Now we have second best pair, and it's likely that one of those cards within our opponent's range of hands that they're calling a 3-bet with is either going to be an ace, a king, or a queen. In position, it's a lot easier to play the hand because we get to see what they do and we can check back the flop. But out of position, let's say that we check the flop and our opponent bets. Well, what do? It's a lot harder to play out of position, especially in a 3-bet pot, when it's likely that a card that's higher than ours hits our opponent's range on that flop. And again, as we go through the course, you'll see this in action. And so when we're out of position, we're perfectly fine with getting them to fold. Let's say that they put in a 3 big blind raise and there's a 1.5 big blind from the blinds. Well, if they fold, that's 4.5 big blinds. We win there without going to the flop and without there being any rake. We go to the flop, then it's going to be a lot harder. And actually, if we raise to 3.5x, then it's going to be a total of 5 big blinds and not 4.5. So that's why we do bet more when we're out of position, just because of our positional disadvantage. We want to increase the sizing, and it's okay if our opponents fold. So I want you to look at it from this perspective. Whether they call or they fold, a win is a win. And even if we just look at just the blinds alone, getting away from 3-betting, I stated earlier in the course that playing from the button is the most profitable decision or position. And that's because playing from the button is a position where we can steal the blinds the most often. And if we're just adding that additional 1.5 big blinds that we're stealing from the blinds, it increases our win weight drastically. So we're fine if our opponents fold, and we're fine as if they call as well. So anyways, I just wanted to expand on that a bit further, and that's going to conclude our discussion on 3-betting fundamentals. In the next video, we're going to take a deeper dive look at 3-betting for value. So if you have any questions about what we covered in here, please let me know. If you have questions about the specific ranges, please hold off, because we're going to talk about those in their own videos. So hold off on asking those type of questions until you watch the remaining videos in the section where we talk about 3-betting for value and 3-betting as a bluff.